Jared is an organic gardener and home preserver who loves to share the bounty of Oregon's farms and gardens. Jared is the statewide manager for OSU Extension's food security and safety programs. He supports the Master Food Preserver program along with other food access efforts. So Jared, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
This is a super fun topic. I'm excited to be able to talk with you all and share some of my joys from the garden this time of year. I'm going to share screen here. Start the presentation. Okay. So holiday feast from the garden. There's so much to talk about. And in approaching this topic, I was like, well, geez, what's the most important, or what's the essential? And I decided I couldn't figure out what the most important was or what the most essential was, but I could tell you what some of my favorite things are. So in putting this together, there's so many things to talk about. I just chose a few really food types that are important to me, that I think are really fun this time of year, and share some preservation techniques. But first, a little bit about me. Becky already introduced me, but I am the Food Security and Safety Program Manager with OSU Extension, which means I get to coordinate volunteer efforts around the state to teach people about safe food preservation from their farms or gardens. And we also are working to start new programs around food access to make sure everyone has access to food that is healthy, nutritious, and culturally relevant to their diets. Prior to this position, I ran the Marion Folk Food Share Youth Farm and Community Garden Network here in Marion County. And so I have a lot of experience running an organic farm and gardening at home and in community gardens. And I've been a home preserver and cook, well, for a very long time now, but not always. I'll get into that in a second. And I am now an extension educator, which means I am here to bring the research that the university has done on food preservation out into the community to teach people those techniques. But I want to start with a question for you all in the chat, if you don't mind, or if you want to shout it out. Now's like the one time. I know Becky said unmute. But just to get you engaged a little bit, what do you eat from your garden this time of year? And maybe more importantly, why? So I'll give you a second to think about that question. What do you eat from your garden this time of year, and why? You want to type it in the chat if you have a contribution. Right, got a few responses coming in. Apples, right? It's one of the big joys of this time of year. Of course, foods that I preserved, not much going in the garden at the moment. Yeah, our weather has kind of changed. So a lot of those summer veggies are completely done now. Zucchini, peas, that's what's left. I'm impressed you still got zucchini coming on. That's great. Anything I can find because it's good. I like it. Usually we eat artichokes, raspberries, strawberries, and blueberries because they're perennial. It's great. A lot of good things you can preserve there too. And sadly, no garden this year. It was a tough year for gardening, that's for sure. The late rains we had. Great. Those are some great responses. Thanks for sharing. Because I'm going to get to share what I love to eat from my garden for the rest. That's good that you get a second to tell me. So why do we eat from our garden? I have three big answers as to why I got into this. I didn't grow up eating food from a garden because I didn't have a garden. My parents worked multiple jobs, and food was always had to be fast and convenient because there was never very much time for preserving or preparing meals, complex meals. My mom loves to cook. She grew up on a farm. She knows how to preserve food. But when I was growing up, there just simply wasn't enough time. And so food always had to be quick and convenient. It wasn't until I was in graduate school and living on my own, and I had a little bit more free time, that I discovered some of the reasons why people might be interested in gardening. I never thought I would enjoy it, so I just didn't do it as a kid. But I fell in love, first of all, with the flavors. So that picture on the far side of the screen with the purple sprouting broccoli is an example of just one of these foods I had never been exposed to. And then I discovered this great joy. It's this wonderful vegetable. It's like got this unique color and a unique flavor that you're never going to find in the grocery store. Well, at least not yet. And you kind of have to grow it for yourself or know a farmer that's growing it, because it's a unique vegetable that it grows over the winter and then it sprouts in late winter, early spring. So flavors was number one. Nutrition. I also got interested in gardening and eating out of my garden because I found that I wasn't feeling great all the time with a lot of the processed foods that I was eating. I didn't have a diagnosed condition. I just felt low energy and didn't feel very sharp. But as I started eating fresher food and eating more out of the garden, I felt a general sort of health improvement. And the last reason is kind of a big category for me, sense of place. Right, to feel like I am supporting an environment with a healthy garden and I'm eating out of my home. It's kind of an incredible feeling to feel sustained by the environment around you. So those are my big three reasons as to why I got interested in growing more of my own food and preserving it, even though I didn't grow up doing it, which I know many of you on the call maybe did have the good fortune of growing up doing that. So a holiday feast, that's the topic for today. I'm going to go through and just present to you a main dish, a salad, and a dessert grown from the garden. I'm going to talk about suitable cultivars that you can grow here in the Pacific Northwest to make some of these foods. We're going to talk about different ways that you can preserve that item as it comes out of the garden. And I'm going to show you just a fun recipe that I think is good for this time of year. So a main dish, a salad, and a dessert, all the way from seed to table. So start. One of the big ones this time of year that everybody loves, winter squash. And winter squash is sometimes people have this false impression that because it's called winter squash, that means that it grows through the winter. That's of course not true. It's only called winter squash because it stores through the winter. It's actually a warm season plant. But because it's got that hard rind around the fruit, it keeps good through the winter, especially some varieties will stay good all the way through to spring. But just for fun, I picked one of my favorite varieties. It's a little bit unusual that you may not have heard of, that I've grown a bunch, and it's called Black Futsu. And this is a small squash. It's actually related to butternut, but it looks nothing like a butternut. It looks like a little kind of knobby, small pumpkin. And it's originally from Japan. Well, not originally, squashes originally come from the Americas, but this heirloom was bred and selected in Japan in the late 19th century, and has been kept in cultivation there. And only more recently, in the past decade or two, has it become popular in the United States. And the reason I picked it is just because it tastes really, really good. It has a thin skin, kind of like delicata. So you can eat the skin and the flesh if you roast it. You can eat it kind of all together. You don't have to peel it, and it has a really, really interesting nutty sort of flavor. It's sweet, but it has, this complex nuttiness to it. It's very easy to grow, right? So like most winter squashes, you plant them at the beginning of the warm growing season, so mid-May to early June, after danger of last frost. And you can be somewhat flexible in your spacing. If you plant them closer together, you're going to get more smaller fruits. If you plant them farther apart, you're going to get fewer larger fruits. I like to do it on the wide 36-inch spacing between plants because they can be dry farmed, which means you don't have to irrigate them if your soil conditions are appropriate for that, right? Especially if you've got a bit of clay in your soil and your water table's high, you never have to irrigate these squash. And that's my experience with them, is you plant them at 36-inch spacing, keep the weeds down, and water them at planting time. And then you don't have to water them anytime after that. You can, it's easy, but the plants don't need it necessarily. And you'll still get really good, tasty squash and a good harvest. Protect from cucumber beetles. I've used two methods for that. I've used rime, which is a row cover that you can stretch over the plant and use the soil around the plant to seal the edge of the rime. It's a fabric that goes over it, and it's a barrier that keeps the cucumber beetles out. Or you can dip the plant at the time of transplanting into kaolin clay which is, again, it's a barrier, but it's a mineral barrier that the cucumber beetles don't like to nibble on the leaves when it has this white powdery clay on the surface of it. The Rime works best, in my opinion. And then once they start to flower, you remove that barrier from the plant so the bees can get in there and pollinate it. In 105 days to maturity. I'm going to move on and talk about harvesting the squash in a second, but in case you can't find that variety, the seeds can sometimes be difficult to find. Some of the major seed companies have them, but there's a bunch of other fun ones that are also Japanese heirlooms that I think really are some of the most flavorful squash on the market that you can grow in your garden. So the kabocha type is another whole family that are Japanese squashes. And they all have this dense, dry flesh that roasts really, really well. And that's kind of what they were bred for by the Japanese farmers. There's a whole publication that Extension has on growing kabocha squash in Western Oregon. If you just Google kabocha and buttercup squash for Western Oregon, you'll find it. And it's got a ton of information about everything from seed through to harvest on those squash. Okay, but getting closer to the harvest and storage of these. Winter squash, generally, I have always waited until the vines are dead before I pick. They are technically ripe before then, but you have to really know your squash varieties to know when they're ripe before then. So the easiest indicator, if you're growing a bunch of different types of squash, is wait until the vines have withered. You want to pick them before a major rain comes, because there are a lot of spoilage microbes in the soil that when it starts to rain, it splashes up on the squash, and you're more likely to get rotting in your root cellar or in your storage cabinet a month down the line. If it's rained and then you harvest a squash and dry it off, it's not going to keep as long. So if you can still harvest it during the dry season, you're going to have much better luck storing it long term. Okay, so wait till the vine withers, pick it. For most varieties, you're going to leave the stem on the squash. If you pull that stem off completely, then that's an entry point for more of those spoilage organisms. So for most varieties, you're going to keep that stem on there. Curing, right? So winter squash, when you pick it from the vine, is often not at its sweetest. There's a lot of complex starches in there that take time to turn into sugars that are tastier to humans. So you got to give it some time. What I've had the best success with is curing them in a dry hoop house that has ventilation in it with a shade cloth over it. So that's very warm inside there. There's a little bit of sunlight and a good airflow moving through. And that warm spot helps them develop those sugars faster, right? So 2 to 4 weeks before you put it into long-term storage. That's an optional step, right? They'll cure on their own kind of in colder storage, but I think for optimum flavor, that curing is it's a nice safeguard. Storage, winter squash, the ideal temperature is 50 to 55 degrees. If you get them too cold, they start to degrade a lot faster. So that's like basement temperatures, really, or root cellar temperatures is kind of the ideal for them. Depending on how you store them, they can last a long time, right? They can last all the way through winter, hence the name, winter squash. Thinner skin varieties like delicata or really sugary varieties like acorn don't last anywhere near as long, about a month, maybe 2 months. So you want to eat those first if you're growing a bunch of kinds of squash, and then keep your big thick skin Hubbards for March. Hold on to those because those will stay good for a long time. Again, I'm going to point you to another Extension publication, this one called Storing Pumpkin and Winter Squash at Home. And that is a guide that lists a bunch of different types of squash and the storage length, as well as some other tips on how to store them longer. So lots of good stuff on the Extension site if you poke around. Okay, preservation. So good thing about winter squash is you don't really have to do much. You can just have it in that 50 to 55 degree range and make sure it's been dried off and it'll preserve itself. It'll stay good for a long time. But let's say that you do want to keep it shelf stable in a warm place. You don't have a cold basement. You don't have a root cellar. What can you do? Well, one of my favorite techniques is to can it. You can can cubed winter squash or cubed pumpkin, which is good for some recipes, right? Especially if you're going to be making pies in the holiday season, or if you're making like soups. I love to make pumpkin soup. The canned squash or canned pumpkin is a super easy way to jumpstart those recipes because it's softer. It's sort of pre-cooked already. So canning squash though does require pressure canning, which is a bit more technical than, you know, canning your jams or jellies in a boiling water bath. So you got to make sure you're following a good recipe. So first thing, there is no safe home recipe for pumpkin puree or mashed pumpkin. It's too dense, and the canners that you can use at home can't get enough heat into that mash to kill off the botulism spores that could endanger your health or your life. So do not try to can at home pureed pumpkin or mashed pumpkin. You can only do cubed, but that's still a great way to store that pumpkin for longer, or that squash for longer. So you're going to wash it, you're going to peel it, you're going to remove the seeds, you're going to cut it into cubes, 1-inch cubes roughly, and then you are going to boil it for about 2 minutes, blanch it for about 2 minutes. Salt is optional when you're pressure canning. It's just for flavor, so you can add it. You don't have to. You're going to pack it in hot jars, leaving 1 inch of room at the top of the jar. So measuring from the rim down, we call it the headspace. Leave 1 inch of headspace, and then you can use that water, your boiling water. You're going to fill it up, fill that jar up to 1 inch again. Make sure you push all the pieces down, get bubbles out, put your lids and rings on, and process in your pressure canner. Now, this is that little quick overview is not all the steps you need to take. If you've never pressure canned, I really recommend that you take a class in it to get some hands-on experience. If you're better at learning through reading, you can also read some of the publications we have on our website. Again, there's one on canning vegetables. But to teach pressure canning fully is a workshop that we do offer through Extension, but it's a workshop that takes about 3 hours time. So definitely not enough time on a Zoom call for me to tell you everything you need to know about pressure canning. The most important thing I can convey to you in a short time though, is that the risk of doing pressure canning wrong is botulism, which is a fatal poison that can develop in jars that have been underprocessed with low acid products like vegetables. So it's super important that you know what you're doing and you're processing according to the steps that are laid out in Extension recipes, because those have been researched to be safe for use at home. So canning pumpkin is, I don't mean to scare you away from it, just make sure you know what you're doing before you get into that world. Okay, a recipe. So I picked this, there's this great website, eatwintervegetables.com, and this is a partnership between Extension and some small farmers and some chefs, many of them from the Portland area, that have a grant from the Department of Agriculture to really encourage people to eat winter vegetables, right? Because there's a lot of tasty stuff out there grown locally that people aren't familiar with, including these varieties of winter squash. So this is a cool site because it's got fun recipes from talented chefs in the Portland area for how to use some winter veggies. So I picked this one. It's quite good. I've had it, and you can use it's steamed winter squash. So you could use that canned winter squash if you wanted to, or if you have your own fresh from the garden, you can get that. And this is a miso and maple glazed kabocha squash. You could also use the black futsu I was talking about earlier. So you just steam the wedges, or you can reheat the canned chunks from the pressure canning, and then you make a simple sauce for it by melting butter and whisking in miso, maple syrup, and drizzle that on, and you can top with herbs, with lemon juice, with toasted seeds, with chili flakes, and it's actually really quite filling. I know it sounds like a side dish, and it could be a side dish, but I think it's totally sufficient to be a main because it is so filling with that sweet squash and the nuts and seeds on top. I was going to say something else about the eat winter vegetables. Oh, right. If you don't have black futsu squash or kabocha squash from your garden this year, I wanted to mention that there's a really cool event called Fill Your Pantry. That's a staple crop farmers market It only happens this time of year. There's one in Eugene. There's one in, I can't know, it's maybe it's in Corvallis this year. If you Google Fill Your Pantry, Oregon, it'll come up, and there's one this Sunday. It's the one in Benton County, it's this Sunday. And farmers come and you can buy wheat, you can buy nuts, you can buy large quantities of apples or root crops, and you can of course buy winter squash there, enough to fill your pantry, hence the name, Fill Your Pantry. So I really recommend going, and I'm sure you'll find some of these winter squash varieties that I'm talking about there. Okay, moving on. Again, I'm just picking some of my favorite things to take out of the garden this time of year. Salad. So chicory and radicchio. This is a fun one. It's not to everybody's taste, but I think you should try it. If you haven't explored the worlds of chicory, there's a ton of different species. It's all in one genus, and they grow similar to lettuces, and they're somewhat related to lettuces, but they generally have a more bitter flavor, and they're very winter hardy vegetables. The first time I grew them, I was just amazed at how deep into the winter they were still okay in the garden, and I could pull a fresh salad out of my garden and make something really tasty. So to me, this is like one of the flavors of winter is chicories and radicchios. So you might be familiar with radicchio because it's the Italian name for the compact red-headed, it looks like a head of lettuce or a small head of cabbage. It's actually radicchio. It's a type of chicory, and it's generally quite bitter. If you cook it, it loses some of the bitterness. But if you're eating it fresh, it's good to have it mixed in with other things because the flavor is kind of strong. So the Radicchio Treviso is a variety that you can get from Adaptive Seeds, which is a seed company here in Oregon. High Mowing Seeds also carries it. And then my other variety pick for these is the Frise. The Benefine is one that High Mowing Seeds sells. And I like to mix those two because the Frise is much sweeter and milder, and the Radicchio is a really sharp, bitter flavor. But there are tons of different kinds, and it's really fun to explore all the different chicories that you can grow. To grow these for winter harvest, you kind of have to be on your game in late summer when all your tomatoes are coming in. You have to be thinking ahead 6 months, and you have to be seeding your winter greens, which I have to admit I don't always get to because it's kind of hard to juggle seeding while you're also harvesting from your garden. You can space them pretty close, 8 to 12 inches. They have very few insect pests. I think that bitterness is probably also a deterrent. This is me as a guess. I don't actually know that. That's what I tell myself, though. Very few insect pests. And they're very, very frost tolerant. 80 days to maturity, but it doesn't really matter because you're going to go out in the garden and all the way through February, you'll be able to find heads that are still dense and mature. So they kind of just store in your garden. They reach maturity, and because it's wintertime, they kind of hang out and they wait for you to come and eat them. Again, I got a link there to a whole publication from our horticulture department on growing radicchio with a lot of tips on that. Okay, the harvest is the fun part because, like I said, you walk out in the garden in the winter and everything looks rotten and dead, and there are slugs all over your old kale, maybe. There will be few to no slugs on your radicchio. It's kind of amazing. The outer leaves of it might look rotten. They kind of liquefy sometimes in really heavy frosts or with all that moisture we get in the winter here. But if you just peel those back, sometimes you actually have to kind of like windshield wiper them off because they rotted. It sounds gross, but inside you will find a beautiful bright red or green and red speckled dense core. That is the chicory or the radicchio that you can eat and enjoy. The flavor, you can grow them in the summer, but they're more bitter in the summer. So I really recommend the winter technique. Storage. I'm kind of cheating on this one, talking about preservation, because you don't have to do anything. They store in the garden. You don't really need to do much. Just plant them at the right time and then wait. If you do want to cut them as near the end of the season and later into February, and you want to get the last of them out of there, they will hold for a few weeks in the plastic bag in your refrigerator. We recommend that you don't wash them before you put them in the fridge. You leave all that dirt and stuff on there and wash them just before you prepare them, before you prepare your salad. They'll tend to keep longer if you leave some of that dirt and stuff on there from the garden. Okay, my favorite way to eat them, again, there are a lot of good recipes online. That Eat Winter Vegetables site has some good chicory recipes. This one I actually got from Bon Appetito, and it's one I do at home a lot during the winter, which is a chicory Caesar salad with I do a mixture of frisee and radicchio to mellow out that bitterness and make your own Caesar dressing. I skip the anchovy, it's not my favorite. So I've got garlic, parsley, olive oil, lemon juice, salt. And I top it with some fresh cheese, and it's delicious. All right. I see somebody in the chat posted the Fill Your Pantry Benton County Fairgrounds Sunday, noon to 3. Thank you. It's a great opportunity to support local farmers too. Okay. Dessert. Apples. That was somebody's answer earlier on, what they're eating from what they're eating locally this time of year. Lots and lots of apples. Okay, so I won't talk as much about cultivation here because this is not an annual. So if you're fortunate to have space for an apple tree, great. If you're looking to start an orchard, then I recommend that you pick some disease-resistant varieties to reduce the need for sprays in your garden. And to increase your success if you're not going to use sprays. My house, when I moved in, there was an apple tree, I don't know what variety it is, that had been there for 10 years already. And the prior owner had just not taken care of it and had lots of disease problems. And it has been a long time rehabilitating that tree, and it still has some significant problems. So I wish that they had chosen one of these varieties, Liberty or Chehalis, that are resistant to scab. That's a fungal disease. It's very, very common in orchards, and it's quite difficult to get rid of. But if you start with one of these varieties, then you're going to be a lot better off. So that's my number one tip on those. I'm not going to say a lot about cultivation of apples because it is so complicated, but it's a fun pursuit if you've got space for a tree, and you can kind of follow the season of pruning and pollination and taking care of your apples and harvesting. I love taking care of my fruit trees in my house. But there is a great publication. Again, got a shout out for the Extension publications, Growing Tree Fruit in the Home Orchard, which gives you more tips on selecting varieties, getting your orchard started, soil prep, the regular maintenance of pruning, and then how you can keep your pest populations down, hopefully without resorting to any sprays. And then tips on if you do get an explosion of pests, when's the right time to go out and try some other methods. Okay, but the harvesting, right? Here's the fun part. Depending on what variety you've planted, your windows for harvesting is going to be different. So you really need to know what kind of apple you have. Like I said, the tree that I inherited at my house, I never knew the variety. But after sampling a lot of them, I learned that they were kind of a late summer apple. Late August was the ideal time. And some of your visual cues for that are the color of the apple is going to become more full. If it's a red apple, it's going to start to turn that full red with maybe a yellowy background. But of course, there are green apples. So you need to know what the target color is. If you don't know, like in my case, I didn't know what kind of color this apple was supposed to be. I was looking for some fruit to start dropping. That's a sign that the plant's done developing the fruit, and it's no longer putting in any nutrients into that. And then, of course, the most fun part is you can just taste them. Do they taste good yet? If they taste good to you, then maybe it's time to pick them. I was a little too eager my first year with my apple tree, and I thought they tasted all right, and I started picking them. And then I discovered that like 3 weeks later, they tasted way better. Don't be too eager. They will get sweeter. But once they start to drop, the tree is kind of done producing those. And then the last tip on knowing when to pick is if they come off the branch easily, not pulling down, right? But doing a slight twist and a slight pull up, and they should come right off. and that's a good sign that they're ready. So what I do now with my tree is I go out and I don't pick all at once because I'm not a commercial orchard. I don't have to. I can pick the ripest apples when I want them. And I go around a few times during late August and early September. I'll go all the way around the tree and try every fruit and see which ones come off easily. If they don't come off, then I let them stay for a little bit longer to ripen up more. Storing apples from your trees at home. You want to store them in clean boxes with ventilation, right? So the picture I got there shows some open crates that does allow a little bit of ventilation around them to prevent too much humidity and spoilage in there. Apples will keep a lot longer if you have truly cold storage. So this is colder than most people's basements, well, a lot colder than most people's basements or root cellars. This is refrigerated temperatures, 30 to 32 degrees. And that's how they've got commercial apples year round, right? I mean, they've got other tricks up their sleeve, but the main one is just really good cold storage, which most of us probably don't have at home, a dedicated refrigerator just for apples. But if you're really serious about growing them and eating your own apples year round, probably what you're going to need is dedicated refrigeration for it. You can store them in warmer temperatures. Up to 45 degrees is okay. They're not going to keep as long. If you get above 45 degrees, the quality is going to start to go down very quickly, which is the situation I have with my tree in my house. My basement doesn't stay nearly that cold. And so I can store them in open crates like that for a month, maybe two. They do start to get soft. They start to get mealier, not nearly as flavorful, and they become just cooking apples at that point. But for fresh eating, that crispy dessert apple taste that you really prize in like a Honeycrisp or something, in warmer temperatures, you're only going to get that for a week or two, and then it's going to start to go down. The quality is going to go down. You want to keep your apples separate from onions, potatoes, or strong smelling items in storage, because they will soak up some of those odors, or the ethylene gas produced by some of the other produce is going to make them go bad faster. Okay, so what do you do with your apples? Oh my gosh, I could just do like 2 hours just about all the things you can do with apples in terms of preserving. People love apples. They've been very creative. They come up with dozens and dozens of different ways to preserve them and keep the quality other than root cellaring them. So you can dehydrate them. You can make fruit leathers with them. You can freeze them. You can make applesauce. You can make apple butter. There's tons of things you can do. The one I'm going to tell you about, because maybe some people don't know this one is an option, is that you can make your own pie filling and can it. And since I'm trying to give you guys a dessert, pie filling seems most appropriate. So canning pie filling is pretty simple. It's simpler than the pressure canning pumpkin we were talking about earlier, because you can just do it in a boiling water canner. And you can prepare quarts of it at a time, right? So in most canners, you can fit 7 quart jars in a single layer, upright jars in the bottom of your canner. So that's 7 pies you can do in one load. That's 7 pies, which is, I don't know how much pie you all eat, but 7 pies is going to get me through. It's going to get me through the winter, especially because I'm not just going to eat apple pie. So 7 apple pies is more than enough for me to get me through the winter time. So it's an evening of work, but in fall, but it really pays off in the winter months when you can open up a jar and your pie is like 80% ready already. So how do you do it? First, you have to prepare your apples. And this is kind of the most labor-intensive step, because you do have to peel them, you have to core them, and you have to slice them into the small size slices that you want for your pie. And as you do that, to prevent them all from turning brown, you're going to have a bowl next to your peeler, where you're going to soak the apple slices as they come out, cut up, and you're going to soak them in a solution with ascorbic acid. And you can get that solution really easily by buying vitamin C tablets at the store and crushing them up and soaking and putting them in the water. So it's 6 vitamin C tabs, 6 of the 500 milligram tabs. That's the standard size. 6 of those crushed up in a gallon of water, and mix it around until it's kind of dissolved. And now you've got your anti-browning treatment ready for your apples. So as you cut them, you drop them into that bowl of water with the vitamin C tablets crushed up in it, and let them mellow in there as you're continuing to chop and prep your apples. So that's step one. Then you're going to blanch the apples briefly for 1 minute in boiling water, okay, and then drain them. Okay, so now, now you're ready to make the sweet, tasty pie syrup that you're going to preserve those apples in. And that's sugar, cinnamon, and then here's the kind of the tricky part. The reason a lot of people don't do this is because you have to have a special modified food starch called clear gel. And you can buy it sometimes locally at, they changed their name, used to be Cash and Carry. The US Chef Store, I think it's called now. They carry it sometimes. Amazon carries it, of course. We also sell it here at the Extension office in 1 pound bags. So if you want to swing by during regular business hours, our front desk staff has a cabinet of it in 1 pound bags, and it's $4 for a bag of clear gel. We're not trying to make money on it. That's just, we buy it in bulk and then we repackage it for folks to use and sell it at cost back to you. So don't substitute anything else for clear gel in this, because you might think I can use flour, I can use cornstarch. You can't, because you're going to can it. And because you're canning it, you've got safety concerns about the canning process. And it's also going to be heated up extremely, and you don't want it to expand too much inside that jar. So other creative substitutes you might think of can work for your pie right before you bake it. But for thickening a pie filling, in order to can it, you have to use this special modified cornstarch that's more heat resistant and works for canning. So just don't try to substitute something else. So then you make the syrup with the sugar, the clear gel, cinnamon, water, apple juice. I'll give you the full recipe here in a second, the quantities. You bring it to a boil, add some lemon juice, and then you mix in your apples, right? So you've got your syrup, you've got your apples, you fold them all together. You're going to fill your heated quart jars, leave 1 inch headspace again, which was the same as the pumpkin. Clear gel is kind of notorious for it still expands in the jar, and sometimes it'll expand out of the jar. So make sure you do a full inch headspace, and then follow the regular directions to put your lids and rings on and process in a boiling water canner. 25 minutes. If your elevation is less than 1,000 feet, which almost everyone in Marion County is, fortunately. The full instructions and recipe is again in this publication on the Extension website, Fruit Pie Fillings for Home Canning. That's a great publication because it's got berry pies, it's got apple pies, it's got cherry pies, it's got recipes for a lot of great fruit pies. And I'm looking for, I did like 10 quarts this season for my family, and we haven't broken into it yet. So I'm looking forward to getting into those this winter. Okay, so those are just a few items that you can grow, you can harvest and store or can, or freeze or dry to enjoy during the holidays. But there are lots of other options, as you know. We are fortunate to live in a place where you can grow almost anything, right? Unless you're trying to do something tropical. Things grow well here. I'm from Texas originally, and I was just shocked at how easy it was to grow things when I moved out here 10 years ago. We have lots of food preservation publications about all of those wonderful crops that you can grow on our website, extension.oregonstate.edu/MFP. That stands for Master Food Preserver. Extension.oregonstate.edu/MFP. There's a whole catalog of publications, everything from pickling fish to making your own jerky, to how to store pumpkins in your root cellar, right? It's got it all. Always use up-to-date research-based guidance for food preservation, especially for home canning. Home canning has undergone a little bit of a renaissance in the past few years during the pandemic, and you can find TikToks and YouTubes and all sorts of videos and instructions out there and blogs about people doing interesting things with canning that sound delicious. The problem is that we've known for more than 100 years now that canning presents certain unique food safety problems, and this is why we require commercially canned products to undergo a lot of inspection, because there are some unique safety risks when we put things in jars and vacuum seal them. And the main risk, of course, is botulism, which is a fatal poisoning. So research-based guidance will make sure that you're not going to make anybody sick in your family or your friends that you gift these things to. And you can get that guidance at extension websites like Oregon State. Doesn't have to be Oregon State, though. There are a lot of other universities that have great food preservation programs. The USDA has a complete guide to home canning, and they sponsor the National Center for Home Food Preservation that also has good guidance. And then the Ball books, right? The same company that makes the jars also does good research for recipes for home preservation. The key phrase there, though, is up to date, right? If you've got a Ball book from 1970 sitting on your shelf, you need to get a new one. You need to get one that's 2000 or later, because things have changed, essentially. And some of the old guidance we found was a little risky. So to be the safest, you should use the most recent editions of the books if you can get them, and definitely get rid of anything that's decades old. So I think that's the end of my slides, and I'm happy to chat and talk about other food preservation items or take questions.
Great, thank you, Jared. We do have some questions. Let's see, our first one. You talked about being able to purchase clear gel at your office. Where is your office located?
So the Marion County Extension office is in the Oregon Farm Bureau building, which is on the north side of downtown Salem. It's on Capitol Street, 1320 Capitol Street Northeast. And if you pull up, there's a doorbell to ring to get to our front office. And generally Monday through Friday, 9 to 4 is a good time to come by.
Great. When do you offer a master food preserver class?
Great question. I'm so glad you asked. It has not been offered in a few years, and we are trying to start it back up. So we hope that we will be able to offer it this spring. I'm relatively new to the position, and we're trying to kind of restart the program right now. So we don't have dates scheduled yet, but we are looking at spring of 2023. So I hope that you'll keep your eye on our website, and you can always email me if you want to be added to our email list, which I think that was a question I just saw pop up. I can put my email address in the chat, and we are maintaining an interest list of people that are interested in doing that training. So
Great.
I'll put, yeah.
I was also wondering, you had talked about pressure canner classes that you do. I have a pressure canner myself, and I have never used it because I'm a little scared of it. So how would we find out when those classes are?
We'll be posting them on our website. We're making the schedule for next year right now. We're only doing a few classes this fall, and they're at Willamette Heritage Center. And we haven't done any at the Extension office here. And those are fee-based workshops, but we will be doing some free ones in the future. So again, keep your eye on Marion County Extension Facebook page and our website for updated schedules. Like I said, we're putting the schedule together for next year right now, and we definitely will offer pressure canning, because that is a topic that people are a little hesitant about. Like you said, maybe they've got a pressure canner, they've never broken it out of the box because they're a little worried about, botulism or about canner explosions. There's all sorts of fears people have around it, and we can help kind of demystify that so you can safely can stuff out of your garden.
Great. Are there any food preserver 4-H clubs?
There are no specific 4-H clubs that are just about food preservation. Some of them do food preservation though. And I don't know which ones, but our 4-H staff here at the Extension office, they would be able to guide you if you wanted to put your kiddo in one of those clubs to learn some of that. They could probably tell you which clubs are doing some food preservation. I know they have some kid-friendly techniques and recipes that they teach. Yeah. Also, there's a question about tribal
Yeah.
first foods. Yeah. So I'm really interested in that. I'm glad to see somebody's interested in learning how to process tribal first foods, and food preservation is incredibly important to the food sovereignty of our tribal communities in the Northwest. That, of course, was like food preservation has been a way of life for tribal communities since time immemorial. Smoking salmon and baking camas in earth ovens and making acorn flour. Those are all techniques of food preservation. And due to the history of colonization and reservation life, a lot of those techniques have not been handed down consistently. Different tribal communities have had different stories with that of stewarding their first foods and their traditions. And they are actively, as a community, the tribes of the Northwest are working on preserving that knowledge and handing it down to the next generation. And Oregon State absolutely supports that. And we have a lot of faculty and staff who are tribal members and work with their communities to do that. We currently don't offer classes for the general public on that. And there's a lot of sensitivity around that, especially around foraged foods, that there's a sense of, a story that I hear a lot is about huckleberries, that if Extension comes out and says, huckleberries are amazing, here's what you can do with huckleberries, here's where to go pick them. Huckleberries are in decline because of that, because of overpicking. So a lot of the efforts with tribal communities are to support them preserving that tradition for their communities. And then with some selected food items, there's more of a general knowledge base that's out there around what techniques can and can't be done. An example there is elderberries, which we did some research. Well, I shouldn't say we. The university did some research recently about different varieties of elderberries and discovered that elderberries are not consistently acidic enough for home canning. And that was a really important piece of research that came out in the past few years that had a huge impact for tribal communities and other people. Elderberry syrup is like a really common sort of folk cold remedy that people like to take. And if you make your own, you can't can that safely. I mean, you can freeze it or you can consume it fresh, but it's not safe for home canning. So that's all just to say, exploring the world of foods that are indigenous to this place and how to preserve those is really important to us too. And we are partnering with tribes to do that work. If I didn't grow that black futsu squash you recommend, is it available for purchase anywhere so I could try it out? I wanted to get it this week because I was preparing this presentation. I haven't found it yet. I didn't grow it this year. I looked at Easy Orchards and I looked at some grocery stores in town, and I wasn't surprised I could find it at the grocery store. I bet you the Fill Your Pantry event, somebody will have it. I really recommend. I was going to try, if I have time today, I was going to drive down to Life Source in South Salem because they buy from local farmers that grow varieties like that. So they might have it. That will be my next stop. Look around. It's really good. And if you go to the eatwintervegetables.com website, there's a tab there that says where to buy. And it lists some other potential farms or farmers markets where you might be able to find some of those items. The chicories are the same. If you just go to a regular big grocery store, you can find red radicchio. That's the only one you're going to find normally. Not the escarole and the frise and the endive and all these other great chicories that are out there. But if you go to a small farm or a farmer's market, you're more likely to find some of those vegetables.
Great. I think I might add to my list of gardening items for next year and include some that will be ready in the winter.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you do anything at your work with meat preservation? Yeah, we do. We have in the food preservation side of things, there are techniques and recipes in our publication base around, jerky, around sausage making, around smoking, and there's a lot on canning seafood as well and freezing. So that's, pressure canning meats is something that not everyone has ever tried, but there are a lot of folks who are sort of acolytes of that, and that's one of their main methods of preserving meat, especially from hunting. The advantage of it is that it's pre-cooked and tender, and it makes meal prep a lot easier. And of course, it's shelf stable, right? So if your freezer is full and you're worried about a power outage like we had recently with the ice storm, you could potentially lose all of that, thousands of dollars of product for some folks who buy in bulk or who are hunters. And canning it is one great technique of not only sort of pre-cooking it, so it's easier to prepare in a stew later, but it also saves some of that value so you don't lose it in case a freezer is out. So we have resources on those different techniques for preserving meats.
Oh, we had another one pop up here. Other than Extension publications, are there any books you recommend for beginner food preservers?
Yeah, so one of the classics is the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, which this is for canning fruits and vegetables primarily. It does a little bit with meats in it as well for pressure canning, but this is a great resource with a lot of fun recipes beyond like just strawberry jam, right? They've got some interesting ways to preserve fruit with different flavors and different textures. Another book, got my shelf right behind me. It's convenient, I'm in my office, right? So this one's a little harder to find because it hasn't been printed for a few years, but I'm sure they'll print it again sometime soon. It's called So Easy to Preserve, and it's from the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension, that's where the National Center for Home Food Preservation is housed. And again, some people swear by this one as the best home food preservation book. And it covers everything: freezing, drying, smoking, as well as canning. It is kind of Southern United States focused. I mean, it's from Georgia, so a lot of the recipes I'm from the South originally, so they speak to me, but they may not speak to the Northwest diet. I don't know, but that's a really great resource. There's also a lot of new good books coming out about home fermentation and pickling the natural way with lactic acid bacteria. So there's one, I'll recommend one on that. This one is from some authors in Southern Oregon who have done their research and have some good tips and techniques, safe tips and techniques for fermenting vegetables. This is called Fermented Vegetables. So I recommend that one as well. I don't recommend, again, I think I said this earlier, but it's worth saying again, I don't recommend cooking blogs as sources for canning information. There's a huge difference between preserving food and cooking food. And preserving food it's science-based. You have to really understand the chemistry and the microbiology behind what you're doing. And you can't just sort of be creative in the same way. There's some creativity, but you can't have that infinite flexibility that you have in the kitchen when you can just look in your spice cabinet and look in your refrigerator and throw things in the pot and make a stir fry or make a stew. You can't have that same flexibility when you're canning, unfortunately. So I recommend that you steer away from those. As soon as they say put it in a boiling water canner, you say, no, I'm not going to do that. Just don't follow it. You can follow it for a fresh recipe, sure, why not? But not for canning or preserving. So extension sites, USDA, and the Ball books and some of these others that I recommended are all good.
That's great to hear. It looks like that wraps up our questions. Unless somebody has any additional questions, you can unmute yourself and ask if you'd like, or put it in the chat. With pressure canning, is there a similar level of concern?
Yeah, so pressure canning is a technique that we use for canning low acid ingredients like vegetables and meats and seafood. And those are the items of most concern for food safety, thinking particularly about botulism poisoning. So just really quickly, botulism comes from a soil-borne bacteria that is just in the environment. It's all around us. It's in the soil. It's really prevalent in the Western US, especially. So when you harvest things from your garden, it's going to have those spores on there. And so if you under-process something in a way that's not hot enough to kill botulism spores, there's a risk that they'll grow in the product. So there are two ways that we control it, that we prevent botulism spores from growing in your cans, your jars. One of them is with acid, so adding vinegar or lemon juice, or using a fruit that is naturally acidic. That prevents botulism from growing, so high acidity. And the other main way we control it, if we don't have acid present, is extreme heat. And that's what we get with pressure canning, 240 degrees. And all the recommendations, if you follow the recipes that we have for pressure canning, the inside of the jar, the very middle of the jar, will reach 240 degrees for long enough to kill all the botulism spores. So some people think like, I'm concerned about botulism, I'm just going to put everything in the pressure canner and just do it for a long time. That's not good enough. You need to follow a recipe because they actually research each individual product and see how long it takes to get up to 240 degrees. And this is different for different products, right? Like I mentioned, the pumpkin mash, there's no safe recipe for that because it's too variable. We haven't found a recommendation that works. So we only have a cubed recommendation. So it's with pressure canning, it's especially important that you always follow those research-based recipes.
Right. Thank you so much, Jared, for joining us today. And thank all of you for joining our presentation also. At this time, I think we're ready to wrap up. So we hope to see you at our next First Friday presentation in December. Bye, everybody.